Shalom, everyone, and welcome to Partners for Progressive Israel's first webinar with the Alliance for Israel's Future. Today's conversation will attempt to combine two very different perspectives on the issue of synagogue and state in Israel. On the one hand, we have the perspective of diaspora Jewry, mostly reform and conservative. And as most of you know, our community was in an uproar over the recent decision to cancel the construction of the new egalitarian prayer pavilion in the Western Wall, and to solidify an ultra-orthodox monopoly over recognizing conversions to Judaism. But on the other hand, and most of us are less aware of that, the Israeli secular public is up in arms in the last 2 months, since Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy, released an extensive report on an orchestrated and coordinated infiltration of dozens of private organizations into the public secular school system under the guise of strengthening children's Jewish identity. So we at the Alliance for Israel's Future and at Partners for Progressive Israel decided to hold this conversation in order to ask, what do these two distinct assaults on democracy and religious pluralism have in common? And how can we, progressive Americans and Israelis, join forces and fight together? So before I introduce the speakers and begin the call, two quick technical issues. So those of you who are joining us on a computer, you can ask your questions at any time using the Q&A, which is on the left upper side of your screen. Those who are joining us on Partners for Progressive Israel's Facebook page, you can write your questions in the comment section below. I will collect them and send them to the speakers, or to Avishay, who is our moderator. And finally, those who are joining us on the phone, please email me questions at maya@progressiveisrael.org. And again, I will send them the speaker's way. And if you're interested in hearing more about what we're doing, both in the Alliance and in Partners for Progressive Israel, at the end, wait until the end of the call and there'll be some announcements. So let me introduce our speakers. Rabbi Noa Sattath is the director of the Israel Religious Action Center, the social justice arm of the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism. She graduated from the Hebrew University and Gratz College and was ordained by the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Dr. Avner Inbar is the co-chair and co-founder of Molad, the Center for Renewal of Israeli Democracy, an Israeli progressive think tank. He holds a BA in philosophy from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and received his PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. And our moderator, who was with us last month too, thank you, is Avishay Ben Sasson Gordis, who is a PhD student at Harvard Department of Government and a research fellow at Molad, where he has written on Israeli security, foreign policy, and I should add, he hosts the Israel podcast, a podcast on Israeli politics, which I strongly recommend. So Avishay, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Maya, and welcome to our conversation today. Special thanks to Noa and Avner for being here with us today. And just to launch us off into the conversation, I'd like to start with a couple of questions to our speakers, and then we'll turn to the Q&A section. So Avner, let's start with you. Molad, the center you co-chair, recently published a report that gained a lot of attention and sparked debate regarding the influence of organizations related to the Jewish Home, the National Religious Party, in the Israeli secular school system. Could you tell us a bit about your findings and what sort of debate happened since you published the report?
Yeah, I'll do my best to do just that. First, I'd like to thank you for moderating this and to thank Maya for convening us all this evening here and this afternoon in the States. So I'll try to condense a lot of information into a few minutes, and I will obviously be happy to expand on any particular issue that is of interest to our viewers. So basically, a couple of months ago, we released a report that we worked on for about 18 months that kind of gained a lot of attention in Israeli public discourse and was reported in the Israeli media under the kind of the headline or the banner of the Hebrew word hadata, which I have no idea how to translate into English, but basically means something like religiousification, or kind of pushing people towards becoming more religious, which is an issue that has been in the news for a couple of years now, thanks to the work of journalists like Or Kashti and groups of parents like the Secular Forum, who have been noticing kind of this gradual infiltration of religious content into secular schools. What our report aimed to achieve is to show that the framing of the story, of the narrative that we've been discussing over these past couple of years is not exactly accurate. And I try to explain in what way. But first, a little bit about the findings themselves. So what we've shown is that there are literally dozens of private NGOs. We focused on about 40 of them that are politically affiliated with the Jewish Home Party, led by current Minister of Education, Naftali Bennett, and are ideologically kind of associated or represent the worldview of the national religious sect within Israeli society. These organizations are dedicated to entering secular schools in Israel and providing what they define as content and instruction on Jewish identity. And we've shown that 95% of the state funding that goes towards achieving the goal of cultivating Jewish identity among school children in Israel go to these particular organizations. That is, organizations that represent the particular perspective or worldview of the national religious movement and the Jewish Home Party. So a little bit about the mechanism through which these organizations work. So the Ministry of Education applies a lot of pressure on schools, on school principals, to increase kind of the level of instruction, of education on what the ministry defines as Jewish culture. However, they provide very little or very few tools for the schools to actually deal with that subject. They don't provide any funding for teacher training. They don't provide any additional teachers' positions. And the principals find themselves kind of in a bind with respect to actually responding to this pressure from this ministry. And then, miraculously, they're approached by a private NGO, a private organization, that offers to provide that service basically free of charge. And how do they manage? How do these organizations manage to provide the service at no cost? So they get funded through three principal channels. One is direct funding from the Israeli government, and we're talking about the numbers change from 1 year to the other, but we're talking about between tens and hundreds of millions of shekels. So that's simply direct funding to these organizations. Second, perhaps more important or more interesting, is the allocation of positions for what we call here in Israel national service girls. And that is a very kind of peculiar institution that we have here in Israel, in which mainly national girls, young women who graduate from the national religious school system and choose not to enlist to the army, can volunteer to do national service, which means also that they are subsidized by the taxpayers. This is all kind of government funding. This is not an option that is, it's an option that's available almost exclusively only to national religious women. Secular men and women in Israel go to the army. National religious men also usually go to the army, but many national religious women choose to go through that option of national service. And many of them choose to do that service in organizations such as the ones that we've studied, and basically become kind of very cheap labor force for these organizations. So this is a second source of funding. And the third, as usual, is private donations. They come almost exclusively from the US. So in that way, these organizations can provide these educational services to the schools, where they either teach actual kind of formal lessons, or deal with things like ceremonies, activities around holidays, etc. Now I want to give a little bit of context and explain why I believe that the perception of this phenomenon as kind of religious education, or kind of religious or pressure towards religious conversion is not really accurate. And my main point is that this is not at all about Jewish culture. It is not about Jewish identity, and it's not really about Judaism at all. It is part of a struggle about Israeli identity and about what it means to be an Israeli in Israel today. And what the children in the schools that are being infiltrated by these organizations are supposed to come out with at the end of this instruction is, first of all, a conception of Jewish history that culminates in the, I would say, novel, peculiar, messianic worldview of the national religious movement, and an acceptance of the prominence and the leadership position that the national religious movement is gradually assuming within Israeli public and political life, especially with respect to the important or kind of pivotal question of the future of the occupied territories and the settlement project. So that's the new interpretation that we are trying to give to this phenomenon. An additional important kind of piece of context that I think needs to be known is about the reasons that the national religious sect is actually pushing towards this direction. So the national religious sect comprises of about 10% of the Israeli population. That is, they're a minority group within the Israeli public. There are small minority group within the kind of Jewish people as a whole. But through a kind of a combination of activism and determination and really impressive political passion, they have managed to become what I would argue is the most influential political force and political lobby in Israel today. So if you want an example, you could look at the Likud, the ruling party in Israel, which was founded as, and for many years was, a secular nationalist party, and in recent years is becoming more and more religious nationalist party, because the national religious movement is basically overtaking the entire Israeli right. But what is very important to understand is that it's very hard for the national religious movement to translate that political clout into actual, tangible geopolitical results. Why? Because their goals are very radical and are not things that the general Israeli public is willing to identify with. And as a result, they are becoming increasingly frustrated with the cooperation of the Israeli public with their messianic vision. Over the past few decades, the national religious movement has lost every major battle that they have waged in Israeli public life. It began in the early 80s when Israel evicted the Sinai Peninsula. It continued in the 90s when Israel initiated what I would argue is an irreversible peace process with the Palestinians, and it culminated perhaps with the disengagement from Gaza in 2006. 2005. And as a result of all of these different crises and these different losses, the leadership of the national religious movement, of the settler movement, gradually understood that there is no way for them to win the battle for the state of Israel without, first of all, winning the kind of battle for the hearts and minds of Israelis. And this is a distinction that they make between settling on the hills or settling in the land and settling in the hearts of Israelis. And they are putting more and more effort into settling in the hearts because they understand that that is a precondition for achieving their political goals. And that is the context in which we believe this relatively new phenomenon of their focus on the education of secular Israelis. That is the context in which it needs to be understood. And we, in the paper that we released, we show with countless examples how this is both kind of the content that they are teaching in the classrooms, which has very little to do with Judaism or the Jewish religion, and also the way that they talk among themselves when they explain the kind of the rationale for the project. So my final sentence, and I see that Avishay wants me to conclude. My final sentence would be that we need to understand that this is not about kind of religious proselytizing. This is about political indoctrination. The goal is not that secular school kids will start becoming observant or keeping the Shabbat or
we're stuck.
Kosher. Is there a problem?
I think we're back on. Keep going.
Okay. The goal is that they will become supporters of the settlement project that is the kind of main endeavor of the only endeavor of the national religious movement.
Thank you, Avner. So just to kind of wrap this together, we've got this mass organization working through a lot of small organizations trying to get people behind the national religious movement for political goals. So if that's sort of the case with the report Molad shared, what we have Noah here to talk about is a very, very different kind, at least of it seems like a phenomenon, and that's the recent decisions regarding the Kotel and the conversion crisis. Now, I think we can assume now that most of our listeners are somewhat familiar with the recent decisions, but if you could still please kind of review them in a moment, give us what you think are the important features of the recent decisions and how the Israeli Religion Action Center has been meeting those decisions and acting in response.
So thank you for organizing this. I'm so happy to begin a conversation. In terms of the current situation around the Western Wall, and I'll speak briefly about what's happening on the Western Wall, and then I want to try and expand about the conversion bill and other issues. So in 2016, the Israeli government has reached a historic decision to expand the area of the Western Wall site and to to expand the area of the Western Wall site and create 3 platforms, one for men, one for women, and one mixed for liberal Jews and women of the Wall. That is following 28 years of struggle around freedom of religion in the Western Wall area. And that decision is dramatic and historic, not only in terms of the struggle for equality in the Western Wall, but it has the potential of creating the precedent. If implemented, the Western Wall would be the first place in Israel where the average Israeli family, and it's important to note that there are 9 million visitors a year to the Western Wall. It's the most popular site in Israel. The average Israeli family will go into the Western Wall and have 2 options. They can go to the Orthodox section that will be run according to Orthodox customs, and they can go to the liberal section where they can go together as a family and where we as liberal Jews, would have the chance to exemplify our Jewish values. And those would be on equal settings. And this, again, the monopoly on religion and state in Israel has never given Israelis that option. And that's what made the decision so important. Since 2016, the decision has not been implemented. We have submitted an appeal to the Supreme Court in this September of 2016. And we're expecting a hearing at the end of this month about the Supreme Court decision. Last month, on the same day, the Israeli government decided to initiate a conversion bill, which would basically limit the definition of who is a Jew, and on the same day, to freeze the historic decision about equality in the Western Wall. Right now, we are preparing for the hearing of the Supreme Court. We have a very good panel of judges. You never know what's going to happen when you go into the court, but we are optimistic in terms of the fact that we are basing our case on precedents about equality in allocations to to progressive Judaism that have served us in the past, and we believe that we have a strong legal case. And we are, next week is the Rosh Chodesh Elul, the beginning of the month of Elul, and we're hoping to bring a lot of people and media interest to the Western Wall in preparation 1 week before the trial, before the court date. It's important to note that there will be no decision next week. It's just a hearing. The decision will be later. But I want Avishay to refer to what you said as something relating to this as something completely different from what Avner was talking about. And it is different, it's different in the politics of who's behind it, because, for instance, Minister Bennett is in favor, or at least claims to be in favor of the Western Wall deal, that it was toppled by the ultra-orthodox factions, not by the Jewish Home Party. But I think that we are talking about different symptoms of the same issue. And I think that that's something that overlays the conversation between Israeli progressive Jews and diaspora progressive Jews about what we're talking about. Because American progressive Jews very much tend to focus, if they're talking about synagogue and state, they're talking about the Western Wall and they're talking about conversion. Israelis are talking about different things entirely. They're talking about what Avner was talking about, religious coercion in the schools. They're talking about marriage. They're talking about public transportation on Shabbat. They're talking about daylight savings time, things that American Jews are not really even aware of. But we're talking about we're all talking about the Orthodox monopoly. We're all talking about a very broad definition of Judaism that interferes with our belief system and our way of life. And so the reason I'm so happy to have conversations like this is that I think that in order to transform reality, we need to talk about the source of the issue rather than the different symptoms that we're all experiencing, and figuring out how we look at the Orthodox monopoly as a source of the multiplicity of issues that we're facing, and try and address that.
So that was great. That really moved us forward. Your last few comments after reviewing the situation, what you're doing about the political power structure that underlies the set of issues that may be more troublesome for American Jews, or maybe more troublesome for Israeli secular Jews. I'd like to go back to you and ask, do you also see this connection between the issues, or maybe you could describe the power structure and how you understand it playing in these two issues?
Avishay, I'm sorry, but you got a bit murky and I didn't understand the question. If you can.
So if you could give me for a moment your view on how the politics of these two issues are related. Because as Noah mentioned, and she gave an account of the relationship, but you're talking about something that really isn't that troubling to American Jews, and at the same time, you're not talking about something religious, as you made it abundantly clear, whereas the other issue of the Western Wall and conversion sounds like a very religious issue. So how, if anything, do you find the issues related?
So I would say, first of all, this is when one of these issues is an issue that is, I think, of deep concern to Israelis, and as you mentioned, I think is kind of a lesser concern to American Jews who don't send their children to our schools, etc. And on the other hand, we have an issue that is of very deep concern to American Jews, but is, as Noah mentioned, not a very prominent issue in Israel at the moment. And I would say that what links these two topics is the question of, the politicization of the issue. That is, whether or not we consider them or we address them as part of a larger political struggle over kind of the fate, the direction, the character of the state of Israel. Because when we isolate each of these topics and view them only as, what's the problem with religious organizations working within secular schools, or what's the problem with the fact that there's an orthodox monopoly over religious worship in the Western Wall, they become detached from the larger context in which they actually operate. And the question is whether Israel is becoming a more liberal state, or will it become a more conservative state? And all of these different issues and many others in my opinion, to be addressed through that prism, and need to be addressed not in isolation from other phenomena in Israeli public life, but through a unified agenda and through a unified vision of how we view the future of the state of Israel. And that is in the political connection between these different aspects, because by isolating them, we are almost guaranteeing ourselves a loss in the struggle over these important issues.
So following on that last note from the two of you, Noah and Avner, what would you think, or what would you tell our audience listening that you think progressive American Jews should be active about these days regarding these issues? Whichever one of you wants to pick up first, maybe Avner, you're already on.
I've been kind of a political activist for many years, and I've been in contact with American Jewish institutions and groups and people over many years, and I always get that question, and I think it's a difficult question, because I think that it is healthy for Israeli society and for Israeli politics to think of itself as kind of a sovereign state where the people is sovereign, and they should make decisions through democratic processes that pertain to the citizens of the state of Israel. And kind of political influence from the outside is always kind of a touchy subject. So what I would say is that it might be more important to discuss what American Jews need to do, or what progressive American Jews need to do less than what they can do to contribute. Because, by the way, over the past few months, I think that progressive Americans in general have, you have your plates full as it is, and you don't, our troubles are sometimes even seem kind of lesser importance when we view the news coming from across the ocean. But for many years, I believe that American Jews in general and progressive groups and people in American Jewry have tried to relate to political questions in Israel through a bipartisan prism, which is bipartisan both in American politics and also in Israeli politics, as if Israel is somehow kind of a non-political society, and we should talk about, spiritual aspects of or questions pertaining to identity or the unity of the Jewish people, etc., and trying not to discuss them as the political questions that they are, because Israel is a society that is in the midst of a very intense struggle that is, in many respects, a zero-sum problem. There is one side of the political divide that wants to achieve a certain goal, and the other wants to achieve a very different goal, and these two visions can't really be reconciled. And I think it's time for progressive institutions within American Jewry, and by the way, progressive institutions in the States in general that have an interest in Israeli politics and society, to start making it much clearer that they take sides in the struggle for the future of Israeli society and the state of Israel. It will make our lives much easier here, and I think it will also clarify what's at stake, and what can be done from the other side of the ocean as well.
No,
so I will continue on that.
Before I turn to you, I'd just like to remind our listeners that we're about to start the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, you can start typing them in. Go right ahead, Nance. I'm sorry.
So, I think that there are two points that I want to add on to Avner. First of all, I think that in terms of the internal and external political discussion, many times when I have conversation with North American Jews, there's an internal conflict about what people who are not citizens of Israel, what kind of stakes they have and what kind of mandate they have to talk about Israeli internal issues. And I want to spend a moment talking about that from my perspective, because I think it's important. Israel is the largest Jewish project of our time, and it influences every one of us. But also, Israel as a Jewish state is our opportunity to think about what a Jewish state means, which means that we need to think about what Judaism means and what Jewish values mean, right? So if the Jewish state has to exemplify Jewish values, then that's a very fertile ground for many layers of Jewish discussion, right? Is a Jewish state a state with a firm Jewish majority, or is a Jewish state a state that opens its borders to people fleeing genocide, right? Two different Jewish perspectives. And that's the internal Israeli discussion. The Israeli discussion constantly revolves around Judaism. And in that sense, every Jew in the world has a place in that discussion. Some of our discussions are internal Israeli democracy discussions, but the religion and state discussions, and many others. I mean, religion and state has profound influence on many different layers of Israeli politics. But I want to encourage our listeners to feel and own the issues of Judaism in Israel. These are not only issues of Israeli Jews. So that's one point. The second point is that North American Jews hold immense power in Israel. And it really is about, I mean, there's no way that the Israeli government would have approved, this right-wing, ultra-orthodox Israeli government would have approved the Western Wall plan without the pressure from North American Jews. And when we get back to when we go to court, or when it's approved by the government, it's also going to be to a largest extent through the pressure of North American Jews. So the question is, how do we best organize, and how do we also think about other causes that are important to us and how we galvanize them. And in terms, to answer your question, Avishay, about what people should be doing, I think that there are 2 or 3 layers to it. One is getting informed, and kind of like reading about Israel. Our recommendation is once a week, read something about Israel that's not about security, right? The second is when you talk to Israeli officials, they're dying to talk to you, the consuls, the different people in different consulates, Knesset members visiting your community. Hold them accountable. Don't just let them talk about security issues, which is what they want to talk about. And the third is organizing pressure groups. Camp Children in Canada did a small protest about the Western Wall. This gets covered in Israeli press. It has immense impact here. Now, it's best to coordinate it, but any kind of action that the North American Jewish community takes on the issue of the Western Wall or on other issues gets echoed in Israel in a significant way.
Thank you very much.
Avishay, can I add a short comment? Just an example that I was reminded of. There was a story in IRAC a couple of days ago about the way that progressive and liberal leaders in the States are kind of warming up to Danny Dayan, who is the Consul General of Israel in New York. Now, that is, and that's kind of the point I was trying to make, that's a choice to be made. That is, people have to understand that what Danny Dayan represents for progressives in Israel is not a worldview that can be kind of reconciled with the direction that we aspire to for the state of Israel. And if you warm up to Danny Dayan, and if you have an intimate relationship with him, and you kind of a visible one, and it shows like you are supporting his role as a diplomat and as a representative of the state of Israel, it will be harder for us to identify with both with the direction that we represent, but also with the expectation that we cooperate with the projects and aims and interests of your institutions here in Israel. So just as an example to emphasize that politics is about making choices, and that Israel is a society in the grip of a struggle, and that in situations such as this, sometimes you have to choose a side.
Thank you. We're going to turn to questions from the audience right now, but before we do that, Maya, would you like to explain to everyone on the line again how they can ask a question? We already have questions lined up, but just so people know how to do it.
So again, if you're on the computer, on the left upper side of your screen, you will see a Q&A. Press that and you can write your question. If you're on Facebook, on Partners for Progressive Israel Facebook page, you can write a question there. I'm following that, and I'll put this in the Q&A. And if you're on the phone, you can email me at maya@progressiveisrael.org. And again, I will forward your questions. So please, yes.
So our first question, I think, is for both our panelists, and it comes from Dina Charnan from the National Council for Jewish Women, and it refers to the need to create a united vision. So Dina mentions that there are many different NGOs supporting alternative options for Israeli society regarding religion, and the NCJW has supported quite a bit of them over the year, including projects to support common law and civil marriage and divorce, Women of the Wall, etc. Now, the question Dina is asking is what might be Israeli mechanisms to create a passion front for what Avner described as a liberal vision for Israel, and specifically for state and synagogue, instead of all these different groups. Is there a possibility for coalition building? Which are the effective coalitions working? because it seems like we need a force that is equal or greater to the force described among the national religious. No, maybe would you like to start us off on this?
Yeah. So thank you for this great question. Absolutely, I think you're absolutely right in identifying the need for mobilizing and organizing the Israeli society around this. And this is an interesting contradiction in the sense that in every poll that we do and we conduct and others conduct, Israelis to a large extent are for separation of religion and state. Even voters of just last week there was a survey about support for same-sex marriage in the National Home Party. So 51% of the voters of this Orthodox right-wing organization support same-sex marriage in Israel. And so the difficulty in moving or changing the situation around religion and state in Israel doesn't revolve specifically about around the lack of political interest or political support, but it's a result of the framework of Israeli political system in which the ultraorthodox parties hold the key to dismantling the coalition, and their first condition in every government that they go into is freezing the situation around religion and state. And so before the Israeli Knesset begins its first session, our chances of changing anything are very slim because this agreement has already been signed. And so how do we change that? We change that by making that unacceptable, by making the candidates for prime minister declare that they're not going to do it. And we need to prepare ourselves for a long struggle here. This is not a simple solution. This is not a simple task. And in that, I think that creating the broad, I want to compare ourselves, for instance, to the settlement movement, right? Settlement movement has many different interests, but they're all united in the sense that when an illegal settlement is dismantled or when new housing is not approved, the settlement movement sees it as something that is damaging to them, and they know how to act. In terms of the camp for separation of religion and state, we're constantly being attacked from different levels, but we don't have the consciousness to say, you're doing this, you're hurting our camp. So that is I think, the next step is developing that consciousness, saying, and I think that there's a new term that's being used more and more in Israel, which is called hadata. I don't think that there's an English translation to it. It means making things more religious. And I think that the fact that we have now coined the term, what is happening, it's the first step to social change. First you name it and then you change it. But I think that creating a broad base of organizations that work on completely different issues around religion and state is our next big step.
Avner, would you like to go next?
Yes, I completely agree with Noah about kind of referring to the example of the settler movement and the religious right and the way that their ability to unify has made them much stronger than the actual percentage in the population. But I would like to add to what Noah said, and maybe Noah will disagree with me, that this is not just political unification, it's also an ideological unification. And the reason why they operate so well and have so much influence is that they're unified around a single cause. And the liberal camp or the progressive camp or the left, center-left or left-leaning camp in Israel needs to start asking itself about the priorities that we need to project to the Israeli public, and around which we need to construct our unified vision. And I believe personally that the political system in Israel and the entire public discourse in Israel is basically constructed around the questions of peace and security, and the question of the future of the occupied territories and the peace process with the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world. And this is the issue on which the Israeli left for the past 2 decades have been extremely weak and extremely hesitant, and basically hasn't been able to formulate a convincing and cohesive message. Now, this thing, which I believe should be our top priority, should obviously coalesce with different items in our agenda, on which, by the way, I believe, and we all know polling data that have been gleaned throughout the years, and that on many of the social questions, the Israeli public is actually leaning to the left, maybe contrary to common wisdom or to perceptions about the kind of demographic processes in Israel. And so it's true about questions of religion and state, it's true about questions of LGBT rights, it's true about social and economic justice, on which the Israeli public is very much left-leaning. But there is no way that the progressive camp or the center-left camp in Israel will be able to win an election without producing a convincing message about questions of peace and security. And as long as we treat the different issues that we care about in kind of a piecemeal manner, and we evade, and we kind of avoid the elephant in the room, which is what is, I believe, of the kind of deepest concern for Israelis, which is their personal security, their national security, and the geopolitical situation, we won't be able to make any advances on the other issues, because in order to make advances, you need political power. And the progressive camp in Israel will be excluded from political power as long as the Israeli public finds its worldview on peace and security unconvincing. So that's my kind of 2 cents on that.
I just wanted to say. I just wanted to say that I agree with Avner completely. So I don't disagree.
Okay. It's the most boring kind of panel one can have, but the best kind of political camp. So we've got a question via email from Morty Miller, who's asking if the goal of reforming conservative Judaism in Israel, and I would say maybe more broadly liberal Judaism in Israel, to be funded by the Israeli state in the same way that Orthodox Judaism is now. So for those who don't know, rabbis are paid by the state, they get salaries, they have official positions, they're civil servants in the technical sense, not necessarily in what they're doing. And Morty is mentioning that from his view as an American Jewish person, that would seem to be highly problematic. So what do you think about that? I think this is mainly to Noah.
So I think that our vision for the relations between religion and state in Israel is different than the American model. We're relying on the German model, in which the state does subsidize religious services, but the religious services are not part of the state mechanism and are funded according to the interests of the different participants in the religious services. But I want to go back just a little bit and zoom out a little bit and talk about again the bigger question of religious services and what they mean for the Jewish state. So every pre-election season, which I think is beginning here very soon, we meet with the different representatives of the different parties and ask them to include statements about religion and state in their platforms. which is it's an attempt to make them commit to being active on these issues after the elections. And in these discussions, mostly with the center parties, they usually ask me, but if we don't have a chief rabbinate, or if we allow civil marriage, what will make the Jewish state Jewish? Which again is our central issue. And we need to present our alternative vision to this. And I think that once we clarify that the Jewishness of the Jewish state does not rely on coercion, but on the vibrance, creating a vibrant Jewish discussion, creating a vibrant Jewish cultural life and religious life that is diverse and strong, I think that would simplify the discussion on both sides.
Avner, would you like to respond to this question as well, maybe, or?
Yeah, briefly, perhaps. I can be very brief. I support a complete separation of religion and state in Israel, and maybe kind of to continue what Noah began to address. I believe that it's part of maybe the greatest achievement of the Zionist movement by kind of pulling the Jewish people into world history and by politicizing it. It, in a sense, solved the question of what it means to be a Jew, because what it means to be a Jew or what it means to be a Jewish state is whatever Jews choose to do at that particular point. And Israel is a Jewish state because it is the center of the national cultural lives of many or the majority of Jews. And that, I believe, is kind of most of what needs to be said about that. And as a result of that, there's no need for the state to be formally affiliated with any particular interpretation or even a plurality of interpretations of what the Jewish religion means to people, because that is something that I believe people should do in their private lives. And the plurality of Israelis are secular, and that's their interpretation of Judaism. I think that secular Judaism is the largest kind of strand within Judaism, and the vast majority of Israelis are non-religious, and they conceive of their Judaism in national rather than in religious terms. And that's my kind of, in broad strokes, my position on that.
Thank you. The next question comes to us from Linda Cohen, and I'd like to connect it with another question we got from one of the offline systems. And that is, when both of you are talking about hadatta or religification, in Israeli discourse, that refers to trying to turn people orthodox. But to an American ear, that might sound like a rejection of any type of religiously active form of Jewish life, which is definitely not the case, because as both of you made abundantly clear, the idea is to make Israel a more open place to whatever kind of Judaism people choose to pursue in their lives. So is there a way to connect this issue with American Jewry in a way that would make it relevant to them is one part of it, and also clarify that in Israel, when people are talking about making religion more present in human life, is that what we're actually talking about is concentrating political power in the hands of Israeli orthodoxy. So the question really is, what do we do to communicate that this is an issue not of religion in private life, but a political issue? And as a result, what should be done about hadatta, or whatever you call it, the activity of national religious organizations in the Israeli education system?
So I think that there are many ways to look at and explain the really twisted reality between in terms of religion and state in Israel. Just in terms of funding, just the numbers. So according to research done by the Knesset Information Center, the Israeli government spends 3 billion shekels annually on the Orthodox monopoly. That does not include the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox education systems. It's just the money spent on rabbi salaries, synagogues, ritual baths, kosher inspectors, holy sites, etc., etc. The Israeli government spends about 20 million shekels on everything that you can imagine that is progressive Judaism. The Reform movement, the conservative movement, all sorts of pluralistic institutions. And that's the unequal playing field in which the government tries to present Jewish life. And I think that makes it clear that it's only towards one direction. The other 2 points that I have, one is that the overlap between making something present and coercion it's very close. So it's not that the option of being married by an Orthodox rabbi should not be an option in Israel, but it's the monopoly. There's no way to do it, and there's no other way to do it. It's not that Orthodox kosher certificates should not be available in Israel, but the fact that the only way to use the word kosher is if you have the certificate from the rabbinate is coercion. And that really expresses very little faith in the fact that Judaism really has something meaningful to offer people today. Judaism doesn't need the power of coercion to attract Israelis. And actually, coercion makes Israelis distance themselves from religion rather than get closer to religion and religious life and finding meaning in religion. And lastly, I want to say that in many times people feel that we are talking against orthodoxy. And really, if the Reform movement had the corrupting power of coercion and monopoly that the Orthodox monopoly has, we would be corrupt. There's nothing wrong with orthodoxy. It's the marriage of religion, money, and power breeds corruption. There's just no other way to do it. We know it from other religions, and it's only through that we, and it's only through eliminating the monopoly that we can really reclaim Judaism and allow it to flourish in different ways in the lives of Israelis. And I think that maybe Avner can also tell us about the way that religion is used, not only in order to give meaning to life or to create a certain discipline, but also channeled towards different ideologies around settlements and occupation, etc.
So yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the difficulties that I always have in discussing these issues with friends and counterparts in the US is that I believe that in the States, the question of religion in general, but particularly maybe of Jewish identity, is a private or maybe communal matter. And in Israel, the question of Jewish identity is a social and public and political issue. And therefore, who gets to define and who gets to control how Jewish identity is conceived of gains a lot of political and social capital. And that is why a person like myself, who's a secular Jew and an atheist, would simply like to see those two things separated, because it's not a personal choice that I can make in Israel. It is something that is almost by definition being kind of imposed on me, on many others, by the very fact that Israel as a state deals with those spiritual and religious questions. And we're seeing how the religious right is manipulating the question of Jewish identity in order to gain political power and support. Because what we're seeing in classroom has nothing to do with Judaism. They're not learning about the Talmud. They're not learning kind of biblical interpretations. They're not learning about the halakha or about mitzvot. They are learning about, the IDF, and they're learning about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they're learning about what it means or what it should mean in their perspective to be a good Israeli, and it is kind of framed in the as a question about Jewish identity, because Jewish identity grants who gets to define and control it a lot of political influence in Israel. So I think that those are simply two very different questions. There is a way to be a Jew in Israel that is possibly not available in the US, and that is simply to be an Israeli. I believe that to be an Israeli is a sufficient manifestation of Jewishness, whatever that means, whereas in the US, if you don't affiliate with any or take an interest in any religious manifestation or spiritual manifestation of your Jewishness, you are either likely to or already in the process of simply kind of disengaging from the Jewish community. This is not the case in Israel, because in Israel you can simply be an Israeli, and as a result of that, you maintain some sort of connection with the fact of your Jewishness. And I think that that's kind of at the heart of why this conversation across the ocean is often kind of tricky, complicated, and both sides sometimes get misunderstood.
Thank you very much to our two panelists, Avner and Noa. Thank you for being with us today, everyone who was on the line. We had one final question that we're not going to be able to answer. I'm sorry, we're out of time. And just as a final word for anybody who stayed on the line, Maya, as promised, will now talk about how you can stay engaged to the future, in the future, and we'll see you again in a month or so, I believe. Maya, take it from here.
Thank you so much, Noa, Avner, and Avishay. I mean, you guys were amazing. This was a fabulous call. So let me just give a couple of announcements, very brief. This call was part of a monthly series of webinars, which we're just starting about current events in Israel from a progressive perspective. If you join our mailing list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter, preferably all three together, you can stay updated. I also wanted to say that we have speakers, both Israelis and local, who would be delighted to come and give a talk in your community, wherever you are. Email me at maya@progressiveisrael.org to discuss how you can bring progressive voice on Israel to your community. Finally, starting in the beginning of September, Partners of Progressive Israel has a newsletter with really interesting analysis. Join our mailing list and you'll receive them. Thank you very, very much, all three of you and everybody who participated. And thank you everybody who was on Facebook with us live. Thank you. Goodbye. Shalom.
Bye-bye. Have a great day, everyone.
Shalom.